The television appearance was meant to be straightforward and uneventful, nothing more than a routine promotional opportunity for Bruce Lee to showcase some fundamental martial arts techniques, field a handful of questions from the host, and draw attention to his latest professional endeavor. However, the professional wrestler they had recruited for the demonstration, a physically imposing man named Crusher Coleman, who weighed 280 pounds and stood like a human mountain constructed entirely of dense muscle, had arrived at the studio with an entirely different agenda playing out in his mind. When the production crew signaled for filming to begin and the bright studio lights flooded the stage, Coleman reached out and seized Bruce's collar with both of his massive hands. But this action was not part of the carefully rehearsed script that had been planned and approved by the production team. Coleman was attempting to prove something to the television audience, to the production staff, and perhaps most importantly to himself, that professional wrestling represented a superior fighting discipline compared to the ancient Chinese martial art of Kung Fu. The sequence of events that unfolded during the following 45 seconds would leave the production crew psychologically shaken and traumatized, send shockwaves of disbelief through the live studio audience who had come expecting a friendly demonstration, and generate footage so intensely controversial and potentially damaging to the network's reputation that the executives made the decision to destroy every existing copy of the recording. Or at least that was their intention, though as history would later reveal, they were not entirely successful in their efforts. Bruce Lee arrived at the television studio located in Los Angeles at precisely 6 o'clock in the evening on a Thursday. The program was titled Combat Showcase, a newly launched television series that featured demonstrations of various fighting styles and martial arts disciplines from around the world. The format called for bringing together practitioners of diverse martial arts traditions each week, who would then demonstrate their unique techniques and discuss the underlying philosophical principles that informed their particular disciplines. This particular week's episode had been designed to present a friendly, educational comparison between traditional Chinese Kung Fu and American professional wrestling, two fighting systems that appeared to have very little in common. Bruce had initially been reluctant and hesitant to accept the invitation when his manager first presented him with the opportunity. He harbored reservations about these types of television programs because they frequently reduced the profound depth and complexity of martial arts to mere spectacle and entertainment, completely missing or deliberately ignoring the deeper philosophical meaning and practical wisdom that existed behind the physical techniques. Nevertheless, his manager had persistently convinced him that the exposure would prove beneficial for advancing his career trajectory and expanding his public recognition. His manager had made it sound simple and straightforward. Just perform a few basic demonstrations, show some impressive kicks and strikes, answer some softball questions from the host, and collect an easy paycheck for minimal effort. Bruce had agreed despite his better judgment and the nagging doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. Now, standing in the cramped backstage area surrounded by busy production assistants and technical crew members, he was beginning to seriously regret that decision and wish he had trusted his initial instincts. The wrestler they had selected to appear alongside him was a problematic choice from the very beginning. The production team had paired Bruce with a man whose ring name was Marcus Crusher Coleman, and this individual was currently pacing back and forth on the opposite side of the backstage room like a caged animal, directing undisguised hostile glares toward Bruce that made his intentions abundantly clear. Coleman was physically enormous by any standard, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 280 pounds, with muscular arms that resembled the trunks of old-growth trees and a thick neck that seemed to merge directly into his massive shoulders without any clear demarcation point. His background included a successful run as a regional wrestling champion before he had transitioned into making television appearances and promotional work. He also carried a well-earned reputation throughout the professional wrestling community for consistently refusing to follow scripts or stick to predetermined outcomes, preferring instead to improvise and assert his dominance in ways that often caught his opponents and the production staff completely off guard. When Bruce inquired with the production assistant about the hostile-looking man across the room, asking if that was indeed his demonstration partner for the evening, the assistant confirmed it was Coleman and nervously advised Bruce to try to stay on the wrestler's good side if such a thing even existed. Bruce approached Coleman during the mandatory pre-show meeting where the participants were supposed to review the planned sequences and ensure everyone understood the choreography. The wrestler was sitting alone on a folding chair, methodically wrapping athletic tape around his enormous hands with deliberate precision, refusing to make eye contact with anyone who passed by, creating an invisible barrier of intimidation around himself. The production team members gave him a conspicuously wide berth, unconsciously maintaining distance from someone who radiated barely contained aggression. Bruce politely introduced himself as Bruce Lee and extended his hand in a gesture of professional courtesy, expressing that he was looking forward to working together during the demonstration. Coleman slowly looked up from his tape-wrapping activity, his cold eyes traveling from Bruce's outstretched hand up to his face and then back down again in an obvious assessment of the much smaller man standing before him. but he made no move whatsoever to shake the offered hand or return the friendly greeting. Coleman finally spoke, asking in a tone dripping with disdain if Bruce was the kung fu guy he had heard about, and when Bruce confirmed that was correct, the wrestler leaned back in his chair and asked in a challenging voice if Bruce wanted to know what he thought about kung fu as a fighting system. Bruce responded diplomatically that he would be genuinely interested to hear Coleman's perspective on the subject. Coleman rose slowly from his seated position to his full imposing height, deliberately using every inch of his physical stature to tower over Bruce in an obvious attempt at intimidation through sheer size differential. The height and weight difference between the two men was almost comical in its extremity. Bruce stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed perhaps 140 pounds soaking wet, meaning that Coleman quite literally could have physically contained 2 complete versions of Bruce Lee within his massive frame. Coleman announced bluntly that he thought kung fu was fake, nothing more than dancing and movie choreography rather than legitimate real fighting that could be applied in actual combat situations. Bruce responded simply by saying he understood and acknowledged Coleman's viewpoint. The wrestler continued his verbal assault, explaining that he had been involved in real fights throughout his career, hundreds of them in fact, and that he had never once lost to someone who learned how to perform fancy kicks in a movie studio rather than a legitimate wrestling gym or fighting arena. Bruce maintained his calm demeanor and gently corrected the misconception by noting that he had not learned his martial arts skills in a movie studio as Coleman had assumed, though he did say he understood why Coleman might be skeptical of techniques that appeared flashy or theatrical. Coleman let out a harsh laugh that contained no warmth or genuine humor whatsoever, then corrected Bruce by stating he was not merely skeptical but absolutely certain of kung fu's inadequacy. He declared that when they were out on the demonstration stage in front of the cameras and audience, he fully intended to demonstrate to everyone watching that wrestling was the only real martial art worthy of respect and practical application. Bruce calmly reminded Coleman that the demonstration they were about to perform was carefully scripted and choreographed, designed to showcase different techniques from both disciplines rather than to establish which fighting system was superior through actual competition. Coleman leaned down closer to Bruce's face and stated flatly that scripts were created for actors, and he wanted to make it perfectly clear that he was not an actor playing a role but a genuine fighter. He then turned and walked away without another word, leaving Bruce standing alone in the backstage area processing what had just transpired. A concerned production assistant appeared at Bruce's side moments later and quietly asked if there was a problem developing that they needed to address before filming began. Bruce responded thoughtfully that there was possibly an issue brewing, watching as Coleman's imposing figure disappeared through the dressing room doorway. The assistant tried to provide reassurance by noting that Coleman seemed particularly motivated for the demonstration, but Bruce expressed that he was not entirely convinced this was positive motivation. The assistant attempted to calm Bruce's concerns by assuring him that the director would maintain control over the situation and keep everything running smoothly according to the planned script and safety protocols. Bruce remained unconvinced, but chose not to press the issue further at that moment. The studio audience consisted of approximately 200 people who had received free tickets to attend the live taping, and they sat arranged in tiered rows of seating facing the raised demonstration platform where the action would take place. Multiple cameras surrounded the stage on 3 sides, positioned to capture every possible angle of the upcoming demonstration for the television broadcast. The host of Combat Showcase was a former sports broadcaster named Ted Williams, who possessed the smooth professional delivery of someone who had spent decades in front of cameras, and he walked confidently to center stage as the bright studio lights came up and the on-air signs illuminated. Williams delivered his opening remarks with practiced enthusiasm, welcoming the folks at home and in the studio audience to this very special episode that would explore 2 dramatically different fighting traditions: Chinese Kung Fu, representing thousands of years of Asian martial philosophy, and American professional wrestling embodying the rough-and-tumble combat sports tradition of the Western world. Polite applause rippled through the audience as Williams proceeded with the formal introductions of the evening's guests. Williams introduced Bruce Lee first, describing him as the representative of the ancient and mysterious art of Kung Fu, and Bruce walked onto the stage from the backstage area wearing a simple, unadorned black outfit specifically chosen because it allowed complete freedom of movement without restriction. Bruce offered a slight, respectful bow to the audience, acknowledging their welcoming applause with appropriate humility. Then Williams introduced Coleman as the representative of the proud tradition of American professional wrestling, and the massive wrestler strode onto the stage with the aggressive posture of a man preparing to enter actual battle rather than participate in a friendly television demonstration. Coleman did not wave to the audience members who had come to see him. He did not smile or acknowledge their presence in any positive way. He simply took his position on his designated side of the platform and stared intensely and unwaveringly at Bruce Lee with unmistakable hostile intent. The studio audience immediately sensed the palpable tension crackling in the air between the two men, and their applause quickly died down and transformed into an uncomfortable murmuring as people exchanged worried glances with their neighbors. Ted Williams cleared his throat nervously and attempted to proceed with the planned program, suggesting they begin with some basic technique demonstrations and asking Bruce if he would like to show the audience some fundamental kung fu movements and principles. Bruce nodded his agreement and stated he would be happy to comply with the request. During the following 10 minutes, Bruce delivered a comprehensive demonstration of various techniques drawn from Wing Chun, Jeet Kune Do, and several other martial arts disciplines he had studied and integrated into his personal fighting philosophy. He showed different types of punches and strikes, demonstrated various kicking techniques at different heights and angles, and illustrated blocking and deflection methods for defending against attacks. He carefully explained the underlying philosophy of economy of motion, which emphasized using the least possible amount of effort and energy expenditure to achieve the maximum effective result. He provided detailed explanations of how a smaller person could successfully employ superior technique and precise timing to overcome the apparent advantages of a larger and physically stronger opponent. The audience sat captivated and mesmerized by Bruce's fluid movements and clear articulation of complex martial arts principles. Even the jaded production crew members who had witnessed countless martial arts demonstrations over the years seemed genuinely impressed by the combination of physical skill and intellectual depth Bruce brought to his presentation. Coleman remained motionless on the opposite side of the stage throughout Bruce's entire demonstration, standing with his massive arms crossed tightly over his chest, his facial expression completely unchanging and revealing nothing of his inner thoughts, though his eyes never left Bruce for even a moment. When Bruce concluded his demonstration segment, Ted Williams turned his attention to the wrestler and suggested it was now time to see some wrestling techniques, asking Coleman if he would like to demonstrate some fundamental moves from his discipline. Coleman walked slowly to the center of the stage with deliberate, measured steps that somehow conveyed menace despite the supposedly friendly context, and then announced that rather than performing abstract demonstrations in isolation, he would prefer to demonstrate his techniques directly on Bruce Lee himself. The audience responded with nervous laughter, uncertain whether this was part of the planned entertainment or something else entirely. Ted Williams maintained his professional smile, but careful observers could detect the uncertainty and concern that had crept into his eyes as he attempted to smooth over the moment by explaining that having the two practitioners work together was actually part of the planned show format for the evening. He reminded the folks watching both in the studio and at home that everything they were about to witness was carefully choreographed for both safety and entertainment value, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence when making this assurance. Williams looked at Bruce and asked if he was ready to proceed with the interactive demonstration portion of the program, and Bruce responded with a simple affirmative nod. Williams then directed the same question to Coleman, asking if he was ready to begin. Coleman smiled for the first time all evening, though there was something predatory and unsettling in that smile that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats, and he responded that he was more than ready to demonstrate what real wrestling could accomplish. According to the carefully planned and rehearsed script that had been approved by the production team and network executives, the demonstration sequence was designed to be simple, safe, and educational without any element of actual competition or conflict. Coleman would grab Bruce's collar using a standard wrestling hold that was common in the sport, and Bruce would then show the audience how to escape from that hold using specific kung fu techniques and principles. They would repeat this basic pattern with several different types of holds and grips, pausing after each one to explain the underlying principles behind each counter technique and escape method to help viewers understand the reasoning rather than just seeing the physical movements. The entire sequence was meant to be easy to execute, completely safe for both participants, and tightly controlled to prevent any possibility of injury or genuine conflict. However, when Coleman reached out and grabbed Bruce's collar as the demonstration began, he did not follow the script that had been rehearsed or maintain the gentle theatrical grip they had practiced during the brief run-through. Instead of the loose, cooperative hold they had agreed upon, Coleman seized Bruce's shirt with both of his enormous hands and pulled with sudden, violent force, bunching and twisting the fabric to trap Bruce's upper body against his massive chest in a genuinely restrictive hold. Bruce felt his feet leave the platform floor as Coleman lifted him into the air with apparent ease, demonstrating his superior size and raw physical strength to everyone watching. The studio audience released a collective gasp of surprise and concern at this unexpected turn of events that clearly deviated from what they had been told to expect. Coleman's voice came out as a low growl that was nonetheless loud enough for the sensitive stage microphones to pick up and transmit, as he announced his intention to show everyone watching what wrestling could really accomplish and what happened to movie fighters when they encountered real-world combat situations rather than choreographed fight scenes. Bruce's eyes met Coleman's gaze, and in that moment of direct eye contact, he clearly saw the genuine intention burning there, The desire to humiliate and embarrass Bruce in front of the cameras and live audience, to prove a point about the superiority of wrestling over martial arts, to demonstrate his physical dominance over this smaller man who had earned fame and recognition through what Coleman perceived as fake movie fighting rather than legitimate combat sports. Coleman was not following the agreed-upon script or maintaining the professional boundaries that should govern such a demonstration. This had become a real confrontation with real stakes for both men's reputations and careers. Bruce spoke quietly but firmly, telling Coleman to release his grip and let him go immediately. Coleman responded with a mocking challenge, telling Bruce to make him let go if he was capable of doing so. The production team in the control room realized almost immediately that something had gone seriously wrong with what should have been a routine, safe demonstration. The director, an experienced television veteran named Howard Chen, who had overseen hundreds of live broadcasts, spoke with urgent concern into his headset communication system, demanding to know what was happening on his stage and pointing out that this aggressive physical confrontation was absolutely not in the approved script. His assistant director responded through the headset that Coleman had gone completely off-book and was actually restraining Bruce Lee with genuine force rather than performing the rehearsed theatrical holds. Chen immediately ordered security personnel to be ready for potential intervention if the situation continued to escalate, and his assistant confirmed that security teams were already moving into position near the stage entrances. On the stage itself, host Ted Williams was desperately trying to maintain his professional composure and pretend this was all part of the planned entertainment, speaking to the audience and television cameras with forced cheerfulness about what an intense and realistic demonstration they were witnessing of the incredible power of wrestling holds and techniques. However, Coleman interrupted Williams's attempted spin control, his booming voice easily overpowering the host's more measured tones as he announced to everyone within earshot that this was not a mere demonstration, but rather a lesson that needed to be taught and learned. He declared that all of Bruce's fancy kung fu movements, all those impressive-looking kicks and strikes, all the elaborate techniques and philosophical explanations ultimately meant absolutely nothing when a real fighter who possessed genuine combat skills managed to get his hands on you and establish physical control. Coleman punctuated his verbal assault by violently shaking Bruce like a rag doll, lifting the much smaller man even higher off the ground to ensure that all the cameras positioned around the stage captured every moment of what Coleman clearly intended to be Bruce's humiliation and the definitive proof of wrestling's superiority. The studio audience had fallen completely silent by this point, the earlier nervous laughter having evaporated entirely as people began to recognize that what they were witnessing no longer felt like entertainment or a friendly sporting demonstration, but rather something genuinely hostile and potentially dangerous that had gone beyond acceptable boundaries. Bruce remained remarkably calm despite being physically manhandled and suspended in the air, his facial expression showing no visible signs of fear or panic, but rather displaying an intense concentration and focused awareness of every detail of the situation. Bruce spoke softly, his voice steady despite his compromised physical position, offering Coleman one final opportunity to release his grip voluntarily and end this confrontation before it escalated further. Coleman responded with a mocking laugh and asked what Bruce thought he could possibly do about the situation, challenging whether the smaller man believed he could kick or punch his way out of being held by a superior wrestler who had established complete physical control. Coleman emphasized his apparent total dominance by stating that he had Bruce trapped, and there was absolutely nothing Bruce could do to escape because he was not going anywhere as long as Coleman maintained his iron grip. Bruce's response was quietly spoken, but carried undertones of certainty and controlled confidence as he agreed with Coleman's assessment that he was indeed not going anywhere, but then his hands began to move with precise, economical motions that had been refined through decades of disciplined training and practical application. What happened during the next 3 seconds would be analyzed frame by frame for generations to come by martial artists studying the footage, but for Coleman experiencing it in real time, those 3 seconds seemed to stretch into an eternity of confusion, pain, and the shocking realization that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Bruce's fingers moved with surgical precision to find a specific pressure point located at the base of Coleman's thumb, a neurological target spot no larger than a quarter where major nerves passed close enough to the skin surface to be vulnerable to precise manipulation by someone who possessed the knowledge and skill to exploit this anatomical weakness. Bruce applied hard, focused pressure with exactly the calculated amount of force necessary to trigger an involuntary neuromuscular response in Coleman's hands and forearms. Coleman's crushing grip spasmed open involuntarily as if Bruce's collar had suddenly transformed into electrified wire delivering painful shocks, his fingers releasing their hold without any conscious decision on Coleman's part to let go because his nervous system had been directly manipulated to force the release. Before the massive wrestler could process what had happened or attempt to recover his grip and regain control of the situation, Bruce had already dropped smoothly to his feet on the platform and pivoted with fluid economy of movement to position himself behind Coleman's unprotected back. Bruce's leg swept Coleman's ankle at precisely the exact moment when the bigger man's body weight was shifting forward onto that foot, completely destroying Coleman's balance and foundation. The enormous wrestler, all 280 pounds of dense muscle and bone, crashed down onto the stage floor with tremendous force and impact. The collision of Coleman's body with the wooden platform created a thunderous sound that shook the entire stage structure and caused several nearby cameras to wobble on their mounts as the vibration traveled through the floor. The studio audience released a collective cry of shock and disbelief at witnessing the seemingly impossible sight of the massive professional wrestler being brought down to the floor by a man less than half his size. But Bruce was not yet finished with his response to Coleman's aggression and violation of their professional agreement as he followed Coleman's descent to the floor, landing in a controlled position with his knee pressed against the wrestler's broad chest and his forearm positioned across Coleman's throat with precisely calibrated pressure that was sufficient to establish complete control without causing actual harm or cutting off Coleman's air supply enough to render him unconscious. Coleman's eyes widened in shock, and the first genuine fear he had felt all evening as he frantically grabbed at Bruce's restraining arm with both hands, attempting desperately to pull it away from his throat and escape from this impossible situation where he found himself completely helpless beneath a man he had dismissed as a movie-fighting fraud.